and WEVQ Littleton 91.9.
And online at NHPR.org.
From New Hampshire Public Radio, I'm Peter Biello, and this is the New Hampshire Primary News Roundup on the Exchange. Primary Day, Tuesday, February 11th, is coming, and every Friday until then, the Roundup is honing in on the candidates, their positions, and your concerns. This week, the third impeachment trial of a sitting president in U.S. history began, and that kept some senators who have been campaigning for president from hitting the trails as they normally would ahead of New Hampshire's primary and Iowa's caucus. Hillary Clinton is not running for president this year, and yet she still made headlines. And a new poll shows Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders leading the pack in New Hampshire, but with more than 2 weeks to go, still anyone's ballgame. Here for a breakdown of who's who and what's what ahead of the primary are Ella Nilsen, reporter for Vox.com covering the New Hampshire primary, Trent Spinner, Politico reporter covering the New Hampshire primary and former editor of the New Hampshire Union Leader, and Dean Spiliotes, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. Thanks to all of you for being here.
Hey, Peter.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And by the way, perhaps the most important voice in this conversation is yours. This election is about you and what you want. So tell us, what do you want? What candidate speaks to you and why? Or if you're not decided yet, tell us what you're looking for and what you want to hear from the candidates. Tell us what your thinking is. Give us a call. The number is 1-800-892-6477, or send us an email. The address is exchange@nhpr.org, or comment on Facebook, which is where you can watch a live streaming video of this conversation. Just search for us on Facebook using the term NHPR Exchange. That's all one word, and we will pop up there for your viewing pleasure. Okay, so let's talk about the impeachment trial first, because that was big news this week. If you've been listening to NHPR, you've heard that we've covered every word of it. The impeachment trial of the president is requiring senators to stay in D.C., and that means 4 of the candidates who have been campaigning kind of have to stay put and listen to the arguments on both sides. Those are Senators Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar, and Michael Bennet. So let's turn to you, Ella. What are the campaigns doing in the meantime, these campaigns specifically?
Lots and lots of surrogates. So this is candidates' spouses. In Amy Klobuchar's case, both her husband and her daughter Abigail Bessler, has been out on the campaign trail for her, both in New Hampshire and Iowa. Senator Warren's husband, Bruce Mann, is going to be in New Hampshire this weekend, and there are also a number of high-profile surrogates, so like politicians, actors. Bernie Sanders has a whole band lineup in Iowa right now.
A band lineup?
Yeah, there's Vampire Weekend. There's Portugal the Man. Some people were joking that it was like better than Coachella.
That is a very like millennial Gen Z lineup.
Yeah, absolutely.
That says something. But go on. Okay.
So obviously these are all still draws for people to come out and see. But as we know, these 4 candidates themselves have been stuck in Washington, D.C. And I think that even though the campaigns, feel, I think to varying degrees, okay about their surrogate presence, there's no kind of substitute for the actual candidate.
Dean?
That's absolutely correct. The reality is for these early contests, the Iowa caucus, New Hampshire primary, et cetera, voters tend to make up their mind a little bit later on in the process. A lot of people are still undecided. And these late last-minute rallies and retail politics experiences, town halls that the candidates like to do, or for a lot of people actually serve an important decision-making function. It's certainly nice to have the surrogates. Some of these high-profile celebrities and bands will turn out big crowds, but those tend to be folks who are already pretty much committed to the candidate. So using surrogates is you get kind of a mixed bag as a result. One thing we are hearing kind of the scuttlebutt on social media is that the White House and Mitch McConnell are looking to wrap up the trial by next Friday. Before the Super Bowl, the president typically gets interviewed at the halftime at the Super Bowl. Trump would prefer to have this behind him. He also has the State of the Union coming up early the following week. So there's a lot of pressure on Republicans in the Senate to wrap this up quickly. If that were to happen, that would give back that final weekend before the Iowa caucus to the candidates, which I think is something they would really want. But they're in a tough spot because their core supporters want a full and fair trial. But if it were to wrap up by next Friday, then they would have a little bit of extra time.
And what about those candidates who aren't detained in D.C., Ella? Pete Buttigieg, Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, Deval Patrick, and then the Republicans challenging the president, Joe Walsh and Bill Weld. What are they up to? Are they business as usual? Are they headed to Iowa, given that Iowa is right around the corner?
Yeah, so Biden and Buttigieg are both going to be here in New Hampshire today, and Biden has another event tomorrow. I think that Pete Buttigieg is headed straight back to Iowa. I mean, it's kind of been funny to see a lot of the campaigns, especially the major campaigns, maybe not so much people like Michael Bennet and Tulsi Gabbard, who are really making New Hampshire kind of the focal point of their campaigns. But it's like Iowa, 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 New Hampshire, Iowa, Iowa. Everybody is trying to prioritize as much time as possible in Iowa, because we're going to have a whole other week between the Iowa caucuses on February 3rd and the primary on the 11th.
We've been asking listeners about their opinions about the candidates, and especially asking for those who are undecided what their thinking is. We heard from Volkert on Facebook, who says he's undecided because there are 33 candidates on the ballot. We hear a lot about a few of them, but there are many. So yes, there's a lot of choice out there. Christopher in Manchester says, it seems to me that the Democratic establishment in New Hampshire is starting to circle the wagons and embrace Joe Biden. They are probably beginning to realize that if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren is the nominee, both too far left for the country at large, it's Trump 2.0 in November. I wanted to ask you, Ella, about this because you've been following some canvassers who are working for Joe Biden. What do you make of that comment from Christopher?
I wouldn't say that the establishment is necessary. I mean, maybe like if we're talking about New Hampshire politicos, Joe Biden rolled out a bunch of endorsements yesterday that, including Bill Shaheen, the husband of Senator Jean Shaheen, a bunch of other kind of big names. But I would say that, the energy for Bernie Sanders is pretty strong here in New Hampshire. And I was out yesterday with some canvassers on the Biden campaign. And it was interesting. I mean, there were still a lot of undecided voters. We actually got a lot of people yesterday. A lot of people were home. And, there certainly were folks that were saying, I'm, thinking about Biden, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, the sort of the more moderate people. I'm kind of trying to make my decision between that. But there were also a couple of people that were torn between Biden and Sanders. So I think that, people really know both Sanders and Biden, and I think Elizabeth Warren also has some name recognition. A lot of people were interested in Amy Klobuchar, which I think, her campaign is hopeful that translates to a kind of more surprise votes for her here. But I would say that it's not just a firm ideology thing for voters. I think that people are kind of torn between sort of wanting a real change in Washington and maybe kind of this more normalcy that Biden is pitching.
And I do think there will be a circling. If Sanders wins Iowa and New Hampshire in quick succession, there will be some kind of establishment pushback against him. I don't know quite what that's going to look like yet, but I think that's pretty predictable should Bernie Sanders win the first two contests, which he may very well do. We don't know.
Trent Spinner.
One of the things that Governor John Lynch said to me very early on, he endorsed Biden right from the start. It was interesting. He said, nobody cares who I'm going to vote for. Nobody cares that Governor John Lynch endorsed Joe Biden. And so I think that one of the lessons we learned in 2016 was that it doesn't matter if the establishment coalesces around one candidate. Voters don't care. And in some cases, it's actually a negative for the candidate. So I think, as much as Terry Schumacher and State Senator Lou D'Alessandro and Bill Shaheen, these are real party. This is the old school party. Governor John Lynch, I think, said it best. Nobody really cares who I endorse. And then another point that I wanted to bring up, back to that Facebook commenter who was talking about the 33 different candidates. I think that's actually one of the most overlooked parts of this primary, is that when voters go into the booth, there is going to be a list of 33 different people on there. And if you haven't really done your homework, which I would say could be a large percentage of people, over 50% of people who haven't taken the time to understand, all of the candidates in the race, and you're looking at this piece of paper where you have to take this test and pick somebody out of 33. If you know off the top of your head Joe Biden's name or somebody's name who has been around for a while, I think that's an advantage to them too.
Let's go to the phones and talk to Jerry in Concord. Jerry, thank you very much for calling. You're on the air.
Thanks for answering. Yes, hi.
So go ahead. What's on your mind?
Well, this is fascinating to me. This is the longest I've ever gone without making a decision, and for good reason. The Democrats have wonderful candidates. I describe them as together they're one perfect person.
And so what do you
I'm
think? Oh,
not
sorry, go
sure.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Please
listening to you.
continue.
Well, I was going to say I'm not sure if I'll even know the day that I vote.
Well, let me ask you about what we were talking about with endorsements. Trent was just saying that, former Governor John Lynch says voters don't care if he endorses someone. But what do you think? Do you care if someone that you like, both in local politics or maybe in national politics, says, I like candidate X?
I care, but that doesn't help make my decision. We've hosted now 12 candidates at our home. It's been a really exciting time, as it is in New Hampshire. After February 11th, people will forget us for a while. And I'm fascinated by the fact that they have so much in common, and the nuances that are different are not so different that I'm eliminating them from my list.
Well, Jerry, thank you very much for calling. Want to get a response from the panelists here. Ella, Trent, what do you think?
Ella and I were just looking at each other because we were in Jerry's living room not too long ago.
Oh, okay.
When Pete Buttigieg was there.
Okay, so you know Jerry, and you've been to some of these events, and you're seeing the candidates as well, along with voters. I wanted to get back to one more issue regarding Joe Biden, and since we were talking about impeachment, all of you can weigh in on this because he has been at the center of this impeachment trial as much as he would not like to be because of the unfounded accusations the president and his supporters are making about him and his son, Hunter Biden. Joe Biden has said he would not testify at the impeachment trial as a swap for testimony from someone like John Bolton. He said to the Washington Post, quote, I'm not going to play his game. The Senate job is now to try him. My job is to beat him. So what do you make of this decision on Joe Biden's part, Trent?
Well, I think that Bill Shaheen said something to me that was really interesting last week. We were sitting at the back of a town hall, and he said to me, "Look, I can't vote with my heart. I have to vote with my head. I have to vote for somebody who is going to be able to beat Trump." And he eventually endorsed Biden just this week. But that's what Democrats are really looking for. Everywhere you go, you see these signs that say anything but Trump. And I think that voters who are watching the impeachment trial want to understand how much of a ding this will be for Biden. Will this make him unelectable? And if it does, what I've heard from people in my reporting is that they're willing to kind of give up on a couple of pet issues and vote for just the person that they think will be the most electable. Now, if that's Biden, if he survives this impeachment, he kind of comes out clean, I think that that's a positive for him. If voters start to see him as unelectable, that becomes a real issue.
Yeah, so one of the big question marks of the Senate trial is whether or not the Senate will vote to bring in some witnesses once we get through the initial presentations of both sides and the initial Q&A session that's already scheduled. Republicans have said repeatedly that hypothetically, if they were to allow someone like John Bolton to testify, that they in return would want someone like Hunter Biden to testify. So far, the Adam Schiff and the other House managers have said they would not take a deal like that. They believe that anything dealing with the Bidens kind of takes the eye off of the underlying constitutional issues about abuse of power of Article 2. So we don't know what's going to happen. There's been a lot of pushback about calling either of the Bidens. Every time there's a discussion of a potential deal with Republicans immediately bring that into the mix. It's just one of the things we're going to have to wait and see whether or not it's included.
I'd just like to point out, as far as trying to gauge how much people are paying attention to the issue of impeachment, it doesn't often come up on the trail when I'm talking to voters. It doesn't often come up when candidates when voters are asking candidates questions in town halls. And this is an Iowa poll, so this isn't New Hampshire. But it was interesting. The last Iowa poll that was conducted by CNN. So this is Ann Seltzer, who is a very well-known veteran pollster in Iowa and knows the state just as well as anybody. Did a list of issues polled in the last poll, and impeachment was at the bottom of the issues that people said that they cared about, the most. So I would just say that for now, I think that Biden has kind of, even though he's a central figure of impeachment, I think he has kind of benefited by, not totally getting dragged into it and being able to kind of stay above the fray. obviously we need to see if that's going to continue to happen.
Listeners, let us know what you think of this primary election cycle. If you're still undecided in particular, give us a call and tell us how you're trying to make up your mind. Our phone number is 1-800-892-6477. That's 1-800-892-NHPR. Email is welcome to exchange@nhpr.org. We got this comment from Anne who says, I went to a house party with Michael Bennet last weekend and really loved what he had to say. I'm sorry that his campaign hasn't gotten more attention because I think he could be an excellent moderate candidate with experience. So that's the comment from Anne. And I'll put that to you, Trent Spinner, because you wrote an article recently for Politico on Michael Bennet and comparing him to Gary Hart, another Colorado politician.
Not only that, but I was at that house party, too.
Okay. So what was your impression of that house party?
In Bedford. The house party, well, first of all, there was a waterfall in the backyard, which was beautiful. So that was the number one thing that I took away from that. Sorry.
Very, very cool, especially in January. How is it water and not ice?
It was
I'm
beautiful.
thinking. But
it
anyway.
was really beautiful. Anyway, the house. So the story I wrote, I spent. I talked to several dozen. I talked to several dozen voters. I talked to several of his campaign folks. I sat down with him for more than half an hour, and I wrote this story that Michael Bennet his hope is that lightning strikes, and kind of his pitch is, look, for you to get hit by lightning, you have to be standing in the rain. And so he's pitching himself as this adult in the room. He is doing more than 50 town halls all across the state. And his thought is, I'm going to do this very, very traditional New Hampshire campaign. All the other candidates are doing they're up on the podium. Yeah, they're taking some questions, but he's literally taking every question in the room. And that has been his pitch. The campaign will say, sir, last question, and he'll go on for another 5 or 6 questions. And his hope is that at each one of these town halls, if he could just convince a couple of people to get involved. And actually, I spoke to the owner of the home, who was one of those people. He was undecided. He saw Michael Bennet, and within a week or two, had Michael Bennet at his house doing, and trying to convince all his friends and neighbors. And I also talked to Senator Gary Hart, who won the New Hampshire primary. And Senator Hart reminded me, a week or two before the Iowa caucus, he was at 5% in the polls. He went on to win New Hampshire with 37%. He won by more than 10 points. And so he said, look, there is an opportunity for things like that to happen. And, other people see, some of the party leaders see Bennet as kind of the ultimate dark horse. They see Amy Klobuchar as the dark horse, but then Bennet is like a real, there's like a real potential for him to come in maybe third or fourth, which would keep his campaign going. And while I'm talking, I should say one thing. Gary Hart had a message for New Hampshire. I don't know if you remember, but there was this scene where he was with Jean Shaheen, who was the state campaign director, and he went to this, outdoorsman kind of thing, and they asked him to throw an axe. And on his first try, he threw the axe, he hit the bullseye, and he wanted New Hampshire to know that he's a spry 83 years old, and if you gave him an axe today, he could do the same thing in New Hampshire.
Well, thank you for relaying that message from Gary Hart. Dean, you wanted to weigh in on
Yeah, I
this.
do. I think there's some limitations to that comparison, not to date myself on the panel, but as somebody who remembers well Gary Hart from the 1980s.
So this was 1984. He won the
84
primary.
and again in 88, and they had the whole Donna Rice thing and monkey business. People of a certain vintage
We're going to
will
have to
remember
Wikipedia all
yeah,
of that.
Yeah, Wikipedia. It was a whole scandal. Gary Hart very quickly became a celebrity in a way that Michael Bennet is not likely to become a celebrity. He became kind of a national phenomenon, a celebrity. He was viewed as kind of this sort of new age kind of policy visionary. People really put a lot of hope in him. It's just a much higher profile political career. I've interviewed Michael Bennet, very smart legislator, but the likelihood that he's going to catch a similar ride to the rocket ship that Gary Hart got onto in the 1980s, I think is just not going to happen.
Totally agreed.
And I also think that this is a bit of a test of whether this kind of legendary style of campaigning that Gary Hart rode to winning New Hampshire, and Jimmy Carter in 76, took him all the way to the presidency. I think it's a test to see if this still works, or if modern campaigning has just completely overtaken this kind of small style of just house parties, taking everybody's questions, being
Is that
unfiltered in that
progression
way.
even possible anymore,
Exactly.
given the media environment?
Yeah,
It's
and
a great question.
I was talking to UNH political science professor Dante Scala, who I know has been on this program many times before, and he was just saying to me, look, like if, people like Michael Bennet, people appreciate that he is so unfiltered and taking all these questions. But if you're this far in the primary and you're still just doing house parties, when all the other candidates have scaled up the size of their events, like that doesn't look great.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the phones and talk to Mike in Concord. Mike, thanks for calling. What's on your mind?
So, it was very interesting to hear Jerry, your prior caller, say that her mind was not made up. And I was in the same position until very recently. And in the end, I decided that Buttigieg was my candidate. And one of the reasons, which I think is under described and under discussed, is I'm just beyond the last generation's fights. And to a great extent, that was highlighted in recent news about, the continued disputes between Sanders and Hillary Clinton from the last election. And I think a lot of people want to move beyond those sorts of fights, which are characteristic of, the prior generation. I'd call it the Vietnam era fights among people. And it makes people like Buttigieg and Booker much, much more attractive to many voters, regardless of their generation.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for calling. We really appreciate your insights. We've got to take a short break. When we come back, unfortunately, we do have to talk about a little bit of the fighting that's been happening on the campaign trail. But we will also talk about substantive issues, and we will bring your voice into the conversation, especially if you're undecided and still trying to make up your mind. We want to hear from you. Give us a call, 1-800-892-6477, or email exchange@nhpr.org, or watch a live video of this radio broadcast on Facebook. Just search for NHPR Exchange. You can also leave a comment there while you're watching. This is The Exchange on NHPR. I'm Peter Biello. We'll be right back.
NHPR sustaining members support NHPR the same way they listen to it all year long. Sustainers break up their payments into manageable monthly gifts directly from their bank account or credit card. Find out more about sustaining membership at NHPR.org and click support. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and from Mortal Law, located in Nashua, focusing on family law, estate planning, probate matters, and more, helping good people through tough times. Learn more at mortallaw.com. From Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, providing flexible health plans for any budget to communities across New Hampshire. Get healthy and get happy. Learn more at getharvardpilgrim.com. And from Bank of New Hampshire, providing comprehensive services for retirement plans, including consulting, investment education, and management of plans. Details at banknh.com. Partly sunny for today. High temperatures upper 30s to lower 40s. You're listening to NHPR.
I'm Peter Biello, and this is the New Hampshire Primary News Roundup on the Exchange. With me today, Ellen Nilsen, reporter for Vox.com, Trent Spinner, political reporter covering the New Hampshire primary, and Dean Spiliotes, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. Listeners, now is your chance to weigh in. Give us a call, 1-800-892-6477, especially if you're undecided. We are actually getting a lot of phone calls right now, so if you can't get through right away, keep trying. We really want to bring you into the conversation. It's going to be a robust one. You can also email exchange@nhpr.org. Before the break, we got a comment from Mike in Concord who says he's supporting South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg for president. And he talked a little bit about generational change. And Dean, I think you have some thoughts on that.
That was a great comment and observation. You know, for many years and multiple presidential cycles, it was all about generational change. I mean, that's essentially what Bill Clinton and Al Gore ran on in 1992, and they hit it again in 1996 when Bob Dole was the Republican nominee. Barack Obama, certainly hope and change, running against a much older John McCain. Even George W. Bush, who I believe was in his early 50s when he ran for president or thereabouts. So for a long time, it really was about kind of the country looking for some sort of generational change and kind of moving to a new set of issues. But now we've kind of gotten into back into this area where the two leading candidates on the Democratic side are, I think, 77 and 78. The president's going to be 74 in June. And all of those folks, Sanders included, for as much as Sanders talks about revolutionary change, he's been in elective office since the early 1980s. So he is also part of that Vietnam generation that the caller mentioned. So it's something I've thought about a lot. What is it about our politics now that have kind of brought us back around to this cycle of this kind of elder candidates driving the process rather than focusing on people in their 40s or let's say early 50s. Buttigieg obviously is a more extreme example of that, just a little bit below 40.
We got a comment from Jordan, who is an undecided voter. Jordan says, "I'm stuck between Buttigieg and Warren. Buttigieg is pragmatic and electable, still overall progressive, and would be the first gay man as president and would be a huge boon for LGBT rights that way. Warren is one of the most progressive and has even more policies I agree with and would be the first woman president, but is polarizing. And either way, climate change is still the biggest threat to humanity ever." Jordan continues, "I may make this final choice when I check the box on February 11th. So thanks, Jordan, for your comment. Really appreciate it. Let's also take a call from Cadence in Stoddard. Cadence, thank you very much for calling. What's on your mind?
Hi.
Go ahead. You're on the air.
Personally, I support Andrew Yang a lot because he is, he's one of the only candidates that isn't extremely focused on the impeachment and putting down Trump, and he really seems to care about the people behind the votes, I would say. He is just he has a lot of good policies, and he brings a good energy, I feel, when he's up. When I saw him at the debate, he brought a really good energy to the stage, and I really liked that a lot about him. And he wasn't focused on just making other people look bad or just constantly repeating that Trump is a fraud or a failure. He wanted to, instead bring to light his ideas about the problems in America and how he believes that we should fix them, which I really loved about him.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cadence, thank you very much. Another vote, it seems like, for positivity in this campaign. Ella.
Yeah, it's been interesting. We've sort of been talking about, dark horse candidates being somebody like Klobuchar or Bennett, but I also sort of feel like, Yang kind of has a shot looking at his polling in New Hampshire. It's lower numbers, but it's been consistent, and it's been kind of funny. I mean, I've been hearing folks that I know are, maybe supporting Warren or somebody, have already made up their minds, but they still, people who I wouldn't think would be taking a look at Andrew Yang are, and do like his message of positivity, do like some of the economic ideas that he's proposing. So he's definitely getting, I think, a second look from people.
And he's not an elected official, hasn't been. So he just has kind of a different feel, a different vibe to his candidacy. People are very passionate about him. I think he's doing well given, I think, where he started. I think the national poll that just came out last night actually has him in fourth place at about 8%. I do think that his universal basic income, that freedom dividend proposal that he has, I think kind of puts an upper limit on his candidacy from a political perspective, particularly thinking about a general election. So I think that's going to be a limiting factor a little bit on him. But he's way exceeded, I think, most individuals' expectations, and he's been a really interesting part of the primary discourse so far. And he draws big crowds. People find him really interesting.
We got this comment from Jeff in Hillsborough, who says, "I don't understand why more people aren't voting for Tulsi Gabbard. With the numbers of Trump supporters who have said that they would vote for her or would consider voting for her, I think it puts her in a strong contention to be the most electable Democratic candidate of all. I don't get why so many people are turned off by her. My belief is status quo. The Democratic power has targeted her because she dares to be outspoken at times." Jeff, I want to use your comment there as a springboard to talk a little bit more about Tulsi Gabbard, because she has made news this week by suing former Secretary of State and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton for defamation of character. She says Clinton is essentially trying to paint her as a traitor to her country and ruin her political career. Trent, you've been covering her a little bit this week, so what are your insights on that?
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time on the Gabbard campaign. Last night, I was able to ask her 4 different questions. There was a gaggle, which is when a bunch of reporters all kind of stand together and she answers questions. And so, because she made big news with this $50 million lawsuit, there were cameras from NBC and ABC and CNN, and all these people were there. And I asked her, I said, "Do you really hope to collect $50 million from Hillary Clinton? Do you do you think you're going to win this? Do you think Hillary Clinton should step out of the primary, not get involved? And she really didn't want to talk about it on the trail. What was interesting to me, what's always been interesting to me about Gabbard events is I've interviewed dozens of supporters, and every single time I talk to somebody in the front row, somebody says, look, I voted for Bernie or I voted for Trump. And in some cases, they say I voted for both. I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and then I voted for Donald Trump in the general election. And I've never met somebody like that besides at a Tulsi Gabbard town hall. And what their pitch is, what these voters think is, look, I just wanted somebody to burn down the system in 2016. I thought Bernie would do that. I did not think Hillary would do that. I thought Trump would do that. Now he has burned it down, right? This is what a voter said to me last night. Trump has burned down the system, and now I want somebody who will go back and rebuild it, but kind of along the same principles that Bernie Sanders follows. So, it's interesting. And another thing she said, she was asked by a voter at the town hall, why did you vote present? She was the only person in the House to vote present for impeachment. And she said, I took a stand for the center. And so she's been making this pitch that I'm progressive, but I can also win over Trump voters, and it's yet to be seen whether that will work.
Yeah, long before Hillary Clinton made those initial comments suggesting that that Gabbard got unusually favorable Russian press and that the GOP was in some Machiavellian way kind of grooming her for a third-party challenge a la Jill Stein in 2016, that's the Democratic concern, that she will in some way take away from Democratic votes and that will end up in President Trump being reelected. So people were talking about that before Hillary Clinton articulated it. It was not a new idea. It was already out there in the kind of discourse among Democratic activists. So Clinton had a right to say what she wanted to say, and it's certainly within Gabbard's rights to sue her for, I think it's $50 million for defamation. I think it's turned her campaign into a little bit of a sideshow. And
really,
I think
you think it's
yeah.
A black mark on the
it's about you said, Trent, she didn't really want to talk about it. It's about the only thing that's going to get her a lot of attention at this point. Typically people who adopt this kind of strategy, with the exception of John McCain, who's sort of in a different category, the kind of move up here, rent a place and hang out. Don't typically end up winning. She has, and it's interesting you mentioned, Trent, talking to her voters. They are that sort of kind of disaffected group that is looking for something different, whether it's Trump or Bernie or some of those folks may have even voted for Jill Stein in 2016. Gabbard's comments about meeting with Assad in Syria and other foreign policy decisions have been controversial. She's certainly a distinctive voice in the race. But I don't really see how this helps further. If she's serious about getting the nomination, the $50 million defamation suit, I think is just kind of a distraction.
Hillary Clinton was also in the news this week because she was asked if she would support Senator Bernie Sanders if he were the Democratic nominee, and she declined to go there. She didn't say no. She just said she wasn't there yet. And here's what she said. I'm going to quote her. She says, "We're still in a very vigorous primary season. I will say, however, that it's not only him, it's the culture around him, it's his leadership team, it's his prominent supporters, it's his online Bernie bros and their relentless attacks on lots of his competitors, particularly the women." Ella, I wanted to get your take on this, but Trent, Dean, you can weigh on this as well. Sure. I mean, this seems like a very serious and kind of global condemnation of not just Bernie, but his campaign as a whole from any Democrat that I've heard in the race. So what are your thoughts on Clinton's comments on Bernie Sanders' campaign?
Well, I think, first of all, it kind of prompted a groan across the political spectrum of oh gosh, we're rehashing 2016
Oh, no, more Hillary
over again. Yeah, exactly. So Clinton's comments came on the heels of last week's, kind of gender debate between, that was brought up at the actual presidential debate between Warren and Sanders, and sort of this question of this conversation that they had in 2018 and whether Sanders did or didn't say that he didn't think a woman could win in 2020. But I think that certainly in 2016, I do think less so in his 2020 campaign, Sanders was definitely criticized for having a campaign and a campaign culture that was, maybe too white and too male, the so-called Bernie bro, the very online Sanders supporter that, there was a lot of acrimony between Sanders and Clinton supporters in 2016 and the aftermath. And obviously this is coming up with Warren again to some extent. I don't think it's quite as bitter as it was in 2016 with the sort of the gender issue and the gender dynamics at play. But, I think Clinton sort of walked these comments back after it caused an uproar and said, she would end up supporting whoever the ultimate nominee is. But I think it shows that there still is discord between these two sides. And also there's sort of this larger question about gender and electability that I think a lot of voters are kind of struggling with.
One of the things that the Bernie campaign or people around the campaign have said, look, he's been running against powerful women for years now. He ran against Hillary Clinton and now Elizabeth Warren, and that there are women, that there are women who are, voters who are upset with him, that he did so well against Hillary Clinton, that he is now he could potentially be the reason that Elizabeth Warren isn't the nominee. And so that is something that they are dealing with.
During a forum here at NHPR on Sunday, NHPR's Casey McDermott followed up on some apparent discord between Senator Sanders and Senator Warren over those comments we've been talking about regarding women's electability to the presidency. Sanders has denied making the comment, and at NHPR he adamantly believes, he says, that a woman can be elected president, but he acknowledged that gender is still an obstacle for female politicians.
The answer is yes, but I think everybody has their own sets of problems. All right, I'm 78 years of age. That's a problem. There are a lot of people who say, well, I like Bernie. He's a nice guy, but he is 78 years of age. All right, so we have to argue, please look at the totality of who I am. If you're looking at Buttigieg, he's a young guy, and people will say, well, he's too young to be president. You look at this one, she's a woman. Look at this. So everybody, brings some negatives, if you like. I would just hope very much that the American people look at the totality of a candidate, not at their gender, not at their sexuality, not at their age, but at everything. And, nobody is perfect. There ain't no perfect candidate out there. And all of us have got to do the best. What does that candidate stand for? What is the life record of that campaign? One of the advantages of kind of being old, if I may say so, I have a long record. I've been doing this stuff for decades. I've been, making my fights. Some of you agree with me, some of you don't.
Senator Bernie Sanders on the Exchange last weekend talking about or urging voters to look at the totality of a candidate, not just one particular facet of their personality or their record. Voters, we've been asking you to let us know what factors you've been looking at. Give us a call, 1-800-892-6477, and let us know what you think. You can also write to exchange@nhpr.org. Leo wrote in to say, I am an independent. I don't think the New Hampshire Democratic primary will impact the outcome of the nomination. I don't know who to vote for, but I want to send a message. So I'm going to select a Republican ballot and write in Bloomberg, who I think would be a great candidate. And if you get a few points on the Republican ballot, it would be national news and send a strong message to the president. Tony wrote in to say, I will be voting for Amy Klobuchar in the primary. She has a wonderful bipartisan legislative background, and she's based in the Midwest, and she is a woman. It's time. And Michael on Facebook was pretty succinct. He just wrote Bernie. So we know where Michael stands. Thank you very much, all of you, for writing in as well. Dean, can I ask you a question about the comments about writing in Bloomberg? Not necessarily Bloomberg, but writing him in on a Republican ballot, sending a message by using the Republican ballot. I mean, there are two candidates aside from Trump on that ballot, Joe Walsh and Bill Weld. Are Republicans or some disaffected Republicans or some independents ready to use that ballot to send a message?
It's always hard to measure the exact level of that strategic voting. That's something we've talked about every New Hampshire primary for as long as I can remember. Are there independents, the undeclared voters who can choose either ballot on primary day? If you're a member of a party and you want to vote in the other primary, you've got to switch your party affiliation further in advance. But if you are undeclared or independent voter, you can show up and pick either ballot. And so every 4 years, there's a lot of talk about people sending messages and kind of strategically voting in one primary to send a message in the other primary, kind of like what we're talking about today. It's hard. There are always examples of that, and they tend to get a lot of attention. But I think the level of that kind of strategic behavior and whether or not it actually has an impact, probably a little bit less than you might think, but it's always kind of fun to speculate about how you might game out sending messages by choosing one party ballot over the other if you're an independent. Plus, the reality is most undeclared or independent voters pretty reliably lean in one direction. If you actually looked at which ballots they took over time, they typically go in one direction, but for whatever reason don't want to be affiliated with one of the two parties.
Trent Spinner.
There was one of the things I've been seeing that's really interesting on the ground is the RNC and the Trump campaign have had these people outside of all the Democratic events where they're not protesting, but they're just holding signs for Trump. And so I always talk to them to kind of just see what's going on. And here's something I've been hearing that's really interesting. They said that a few weeks ago, President Trump, and he did this, he tweeted something about Bernie Sanders, and to them it was an indication that he wants to be President Trump wants Bernie Sanders to be the nominee, that President Trump would prefer to run. And so what I've heard from a number of people, a number of Trump supporters, is that they are going to pull a Democratic ballot and they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders. Now, I don't know how widespread that will be. This is just a kind of a handful of 6 or 10 different people. But let's say the primary comes down to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 votes, and there are that many Republicans who are voting for Sanders. It could change the state of the race, and I'm not saying that that's going to happen.
Right. Well, that's the theory, right? That's what we always discuss every 4 years, but it's hard to know exactly. It could, in theory, have a big impact, but we don't know whether it's a handful of voters or 20,000 voters.
And there's no polling, right? All these polls are likely Democratic voters, so you have no idea how many Republicans could potentially vote in the Democratic primary.
So, Trent, I actually was curious if you what the rationale for these Trump supporters is to go up against Sanders. Is it just because he's a socialist? Because one of the things that I wanted to bring up that I found in the latest WBUR poll that had Sanders leading was that he was. I mean, his favorability numbers were off the charts with working class voters. And going up against Trump, I could sort of see that, being a really key constituency. So I'm curious what these Trump people say.
They said, and it was only a handful of people, but they just said it was the tweet. The tweet from President Trump was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but they saw that as a signal that he wanted Bernie to be the nominee.
Interesting.
We've got a note along these lines from Mike who says, as a registered independent, I will vote Democrat in November, but I plan on voting for Weld to send a message. How sweet it would be, he says, if the president lost the primary, which I don't think has happened in New Hampshire since Truman, right?
There's just no chance of that happening. That I really, from 2016, I learned not to prognosticate, but that is the one thing I will say is that is not happening.
Okay, well, mark your words, Trent. Yes. We're going to check in with you on February 12th. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the New York Times endorsement of not one but 2 candidates, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. What do you think of this decision? Was it smart? Was it a bit of a hedge? A disappointing dismissal of the candidate you prefer? Or, since we're talking about how you made up your mind, did it help you make up your mind? Let us know. 1-800-892-6477. Email exchange@nhpr.org or watch a video live on Facebook. Just search for NHPR Exchange. More of your calls after a break. This is The Roundup. I'm Peter Biello. We'll be right back.
A week of political drama on the main stage.
This for that.
And in the wings.
Major sleazebags. They're very dishonest people. Very, very dishonest people.
The impeachment trial of the president takes center stage. But what else happened this week? I'm Todd Zwillick. It's the Friday News Roundup. That's next time on 1A.
That's this morning at 10 here on NHPR. Support for NHPR comes from you, our listeners, and support also comes to us from Franklin Pierce University, offering bachelor degrees online with flexible schedules in 6 terms per year. Learn more at franklinpierce.edu. From Second Wind Water Systems, specializing in treating New Hampshire's water quality problems and providing clean and safe water for over 30 years. Information at secondwindwater.com. Dartmouth Hitchcock, providing primary and specialty care for children and adults at locations throughout southern New Hampshire. More at dartmouthhitchcock.org. This is NHPR.
I'm Peter Biello, and this is the New Hampshire Primary News Roundup on the Exchange. With us today, Dean Spiliotes, Civic Scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU, Ellen Nilsen, reporter for Vox.com, and Trent Spinner, reporter for Politico. Give us a call if you have questions or comments about the primary or would like to weigh in on the New York Times decision to endorse 2 candidates for president in the Democratic primary, Senators Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren. Our phone number, 1-800-892-6477. Before we get into the New York Times endorsement conversation, I want to bring in a few callers. Let's talk to Reeve in Wolfboro. Reeve, thank you very much for calling. What's on your mind?
My pleasure. I think that the entire media and Democrats may be making a big mistake thinking that Biden is the only one who can beat Trump. The people who loved Trump or the people who held their nose and voted for Trump, the ones who love him the most, there's nothing to be done about that, but the ones who held their nose and voted for Trump, a lot of them really just wanted a great change. If we're going to draw any over to the Democratic nominee, then I think it's got to be someone who looks like a massive change maker in order to be part of the change seeking. That's one of the reasons that, now I love Yang, but I think that I think like a half a dozen of them would be amazing presidents. And the second point I want to make is, in addition to that being a grave error, thinking that by people voting for Biden because of that, which I think is a mistake, we're about to make the same mistake that I think Republicans made the last time when they had so many people in the field. If you added up all of the Republicans in the primary, the not Trump votes were really exceeded the for Trump votes, but they were split among so many candidates. So this time I think we're going to do the same thing. Unless an enormous number of them drop out, we're going to split all of those votes and wind up with maybe just the most conservative and I think the one who can't beat Trump.
Well, Reeve, thank you very much for your comment. Really appreciate it. Let's also hear, because we want to get a diversity of comments here. Let's hear from Naomi in Concord. Naomi, thanks for calling. What's on your mind?
Hi, I was also undecided, and I've been to many candidates at Jerry's house.
Jerry, earlier caller. Okay, yep.
Yeah, and I would agree with Bernie that you have to look at the totality of the candidates, which so many of them bring so much. I would love to see a woman as president, but I think I'm leaning to Bennett. I think his experience as the superintendent of schools, in addition to his Senate experience, gives him a lot of insight, not just into education, which I think is in shambles with Secretary DeVos, but also with just the socioeconomic diversity that the schools really bring out. And I think he's just learned a lot, and I think he's a great all-around candidate, and a lot of the campaigns who call me say, you're throwing away your vote. And I really feel strongly now, I think that you vote your heart in the primary here in New Hampshire, and we'll see where it goes.
Well, thanks, Naomi. Really appreciate it. So, Ella, Trent, thoughts on the caller's comments?
I think it goes back to the point of this super dark horse candidate that you do hear from these people who are like, yeah, I love Michael Bennet and I'm going to vote for him. Now the question is just, can he? I mean, he's literally below 1% in the polls. He's in 10th place in the polls. Can he pull it off? Like, I mean, Gary Hart got 37% of the vote, and I think to Dean's point, it's such a different comparison. And Gary Hart himself, he thinks that they're the same candidate, that Bennett has the same chance. And then you hear from people, and there was a person earlier. So I don't know. I just think that I know that from another lesson I learned from 2016 is not to count people out. And so that's why I decided to spend a week with him to write about his campaign so that people can understand this movement that's happening.
Dean?
Yeah, just to go back to Reeves' comments, there certainly is polling data out there that shows that multiple candidates could beat President Trump, either nationally or in certain key battleground states. We see at least sometimes 3 or 4 candidates are possible. I guess the one outstanding question for me is, the implicit assumption in Reeves' comments is that people are still looking for disruption, and thus you have to go to a different Democratic candidate who's going to pick up the mantle of disruptor and go to Washington. And I don't know that that's the case. The outstanding question is, are people kind of had enough disruption for a while and want to go back to some more sense of normalcy or stability? I don't know the answer to that. There's kind of mixed polling data on that. But that's the question. There are multiple people who could beat Trump if you believe the polling, but I don't know necessarily that the electorate is set on continued disruption. Maybe not.
Ella?
Just to the first caller's point, I mean, I was so interested to hear that the 2 candidates that she mentioned were Andrew Yang and Amy Klobuchar as 2 candidates that could bring potential change.
Very different candidates.
Very, very different candidates. I mean, Andrew Yang is a complete political outsider. He's, as we talked about before, he's proposing things like universal basic income. And Amy Klobuchar, you might argue, is a little bit more of kind of, she's arguing kind of the steady hand of leadership. It's certainly not the same as what Joe Biden is arguing for. I mean, she would definitely be, even though she's more of a moderate candidate, I mean, some of the things that she's proposing are, I think, more on the progressive side as well. But, I just think that people's kind of definitions of what a big change in Washington, it's sometimes hard for us to fit them into neat categories.
What's just a thought I had as I was listening to Ella, what's so amazing to me as somebody who kind of formatively in terms of politics grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the conventional wisdom was if you're a member of Congress, you can't be a serious contender for the presidency because you've got this long history of complicated votes that may actually make you look weaker as a candidate. And now, for the first time, we've got Senator Warren, former Senator and Vice President Biden. We got Senator Sanders, Senator Bennett. The ascendancy of the white male governor from somewhere other than the Northeast really has kind of faded into the sunset for a while, and I've been interested in trying to think about why that is. What is it about the political climate now? It really started with President Obama. Obviously, he was a senator for a few years before being elected president. But prior to that, if you were a member of the House or the Senate, you were considered as having too much baggage to be a top contender for the presidency, really. And you have to go all the way back to the 1960s.
Well, Dean, let me ask you about, and Trent, Ella, weigh in on this as well if you'd like, the New York Times endorsement. Yeah. It's never happened before that the Times endorsed two candidates. So what do you make of this decision?
Yeah, it was interesting. Trent and I and others were talking, and, we're endorsements. I don't know how much of an impact they have. I sort of tend to believe that in the end they don't matter all that much. They're kind of an interesting component of the discussion if you think about elite signaling and kind of seeing, who sort of various political elites think are electable or viable. Certainly, they're sending a clear message picking two women here. The article was also very critical of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, the endorsement. So they took a stand in that respect. But they really kind of did split the difference. They basically have these two different types of candidates. Yeah, I don't think the Klobuchar campaign was thrilled about Elizabeth Warren is an idealist and a progressive, and Amy Klobuchar is a sort of pragmatic moderate. I think the Klobuchar folks want her to be presented as a Midwestern progressive who gets things done. So, I think I hate to say they kind of punted on it. I understand their reasoning. Some people have joked that, the Democratic Party is a big part of their subscriber base, so they didn't want to alienate half of their subscribers by picking one over the other. But it certainly has created a discussion about the electability of women, and in particular these women who have taken two very different approaches to making their case for the nomination.
One thing that's been interesting to watch this primary is the local print media, the newspapers, have largely taken a pass on largely covering the primary or getting involved politically.
Local press has not done that. I feel like I see something new every day from Paul Steinhauser in the Concord Monitor, for example.
Well, I mean, I think that I think Paul's a great example of a good reporter who's covering it. But if you look at all the smaller papers and even some of the larger papers, besides Paul, there aren't that many, and there's a great report at the Keene Sentinel. But I think the primary used to be on the front page of newspapers
the breadth
every
of
day.
coverage certainly feels a little different.
Yeah, it seems like it's much thinner, and a lot of the coverage is not big picture stuff. It's like a candidate was at this event, and here's what they said, and here's what two voters said. And so there's not this like really deep dive. I haven't seen any hard-hitting profiles of any of the candidates or any deep dives on any of their positions. And then I don't think any of the local papers, the New Hampshire papers, have endorsed anybody. And if one has, I completely missed it. And in the past, you would see newspapers get involved much earlier, pick a candidate, and then really hammer home.
The union leader was always a point of contention. Who are they going to endorse?
I think local papers may be writing to us soon to tell us exactly how they've been covering it. The Union Leader has been covering it. Concord Monitor has been covering it. Other papers as well, especially when candidates are in their area, whether it's Seacoast, Monadnock, North Country. But Ella, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, on the endorsement, I sort of feel like the New York Times is a little bit like everybody else. They can't totally make a decision between, this this question of, do we want the progressive change? A lot of voters are torn with, this progressive change aligning a candidate that lines up with my values versus this pragmatic, get it done person like Klobuchar says. I think on the issue of nominating two women, one of the things that I actually wanted to bring up when we were talking about Bernie Sanders' response at NHPR about sort of the difficulties that different candidates face.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's true that every candidate has their own thing. Sanders and Biden have questions about their age. Buttigieg has questions about his experience. But I'm working on a piece right now about whether women candidates in particular face a bit of a higher bar than the male candidates. And one of the things I've been talking to experts that study, women in politics and study what it's like to be a woman in politics. And the thing that has been kind of interesting to me, I mean, it's kind of funny to see Sanders making this argument about age, and certainly that is something that I hear voters expressing some concerns about. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at the history of our politics is filled with old white men being in positions of leadership. But we haven't really seen a woman be in, the highest executive position of leadership in this country, which is president. So I think a lot of these political experts that I've been talking to are saying that women do face this additional barrier because voters cannot picture in their mind what a woman president is. And they vote for sometimes what is familiar to them, and what is familiar to them is an old white man. So I do think that, in addition to trying to run for president, candidates like Klobuchar and Warren sort of have this additional barrier that they need to make the case for voters that they are qualified to be president in a way that men don't necessarily have to do. So I don't know if the New York Times endorsement is going to be a boost to this, but it's interesting to see the dynamic playing out.
It's interesting, Ella. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at this, but political science for many decades has had a rich literature on women candidates, particularly women running for Congress, because we haven't had a lot of women running for president. So now that research is shifting towards the presidency. And, we listened to Bernie's comments, and, he kind of fleshed them out at the end. But to say, to talk about women and then say, well, everybody has their negatives.
A woman is a negative.
It was just sort of an odd way to say it. I'm old, he's young. There are women. Everybody has negatives.
As a source,
did not resonate well.
As a source in Trent's story put it, I believe it was your story, Trent. That this comment to one woman you spoke to. Forgive me if this wasn't your story and I'm misremembering, but she said that basically this showed a little bit of his male privilege, that he didn't quite make that calculus that you, Ella, were describing just now. I want to bring one more comment in and then we have to wrap up, but Katie wrote in to say, while high-profile endorsements get press and attention, I don't think it really matters nearly as much as do friends and family. Up until yesterday, Katie says, I was torn between two candidates and was concerned that one of them really didn't have any endorsements and the other had been endorsed by a former candidate, a politician I really admire. But I was still undecided and going back and forth until a good female friend whose judgment I really respect called me last night, and after talking with her for a while, I realized I've made up my mind and agree with her choice. Katie, by the way, did not reveal her choice, which is probably the best way to end this conversation, not on any particular
real quick,
candidate.
Go
ahead, Dean.
Those information shortcuts are essential to how people make decisions in primaries. It's about family and friends. It's about narrowing the field quickly and listening to people whose opinion you trust. So that's sort of a classic example of using shortcuts to make a reasoned and informed decision about candidates.
Well, thank you for the reasoned and informed discussion you have brought to the table today. I want to thank Ellen Nilsen, reporter for Vox, Trent Spinner of Politico, and Dean Spiliotes, civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at SNHU. Thank you all very much for talking about the political campaign today. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Peter.
And remember, this conversation continues online. You can find links to stories by Ella and Trent at NHPR.org, and the conversation continues on Facebook. The Exchange is a production of New Hampshire Public Radio. The engineer is Dan Colgan. Our producers are Jessica Hunt and Christina Phillips. Senior producer is Ellen Grimm. Michael Brinley is our program manager, and our theme music was composed by Bob Lord. I'm Peter Biello. This is The Exchange. Thank you very much for listening.